Let's talk about using sketchnoting in a meeting. This lecture is called Sketchnoting in a meeting. I always bring my notebook with me to every meeting, and if I work digitally, I take my tablet with me. It doesn't really matter, as long as you have something to scribble with and to make sure that you're capturing the notes from a meeting, that you're externalizing your thinking, and potentially also being able to share your notes with the other participants of the meeting, because it's the simplest and the quickest way to make sure you understand each other correctly. I will give you an example how I do sketchnoting in a situation when I'm invited to meet representatives of a certain department I'm going to help as an Agile coach, and I will take you through the process step by step. And will also provide you with some considerations of what to keep in mind when sketchnoting in a meeting. And I will also point out the key points that are important to keep in mind when doing sketchnoting. First thing first, I always start with a meeting subject. I write it down. So in this example, we are talking about an introduction meeting with the department leads. So I would give it a subject, something like Introduction to the Department X. And underscore, so it's easier to see that's the subject. Then I always do the following. I list out all of the people who are present in the room, physically or virtually. So I have John, I have Mary, I have my colleague Pete with me. And then let's say if we had someone participating remotely through a video conference or calling in, I would also mark it out. Let's say we had Lucas, and I would put something like virtual. So it's clear that that person was with us, but he wasn't in the room. And then what else I do is I always note down the date of the meeting. I don't do the time, but the date is important. And if because of your job you're traveling around and you're changing the locations a lot, it might be important for you to note down also the location. It could be a city like Copenhagen and a certain building if there are multiple locations within the same city, so building A. This is the hygienic part of my meeting notes that allows me to quickly remember who was there, what we were discussing, and where it happened. Now, the next thing is I could also note down the agenda. Sometimes I do that, sometimes I don't, especially when we don't have an agenda for a meeting. It also could happen. And in that case, let's say I knew the agenda up front and it was basically down to 2 points: the overview and how can we help? How can I and my colleague Pete here help the department? And then let's say we are now in a meeting. We probably had a round of introduction if we are meeting these people for the first time. And when the meeting begins, what happens now is that I start capturing everything we are discussing on the paper. And there is no rule or no particular recipe of how I'm doing that, but I just try to follow along and try to understand what type of a visual organization is the most appropriate to capture in it. And it can be basically 3 situations. And let's say if we are discussing something static, like a static model of something, like the organization, the hierarchy, or let's say they're telling me more about the product they're working on and how its components are related to each other. If it's about a certain static model, then I would be capturing the facts as a kind of a mind map where the elements will be organized in space, and I will be setting the relationship between those, and I will be capturing those relationships as we go through the meeting. And if they start talking about how certain things work, what is the process or what is the logic, then there would be a kind of a sequential model. And in that case, I would be capturing the things according to the sequence of these things happening. It's probably when we're talking about how the process works or how a certain application behaves, things like that. And then finally, the third type of a visual organization that might happen is about comparison. In that case, we might be talking about, we're not sure, probably we want to change something and something works like this, but in future we would like to have it this way, or we're choosing between alternatives and we would like to make an educated choice here. And in such conversations, I would organize facts in a way that allows me to quickly compare them visually. So if it's two groups of facts, then I will organize them like that. But if we're talking about several groups to choose and compare against each other, then I would just arrange them appropriately. And in the comparison situation, you just need to make sure that it's easy to see how these groups relate to each other. So it's easier for you to make your choices visually, like, this group here is better or worse according to these factors, and so on. So pretty much everything can be boiled down to the selection of one of these organizations. And then as we start talking to John and Mary in our conversation, I realize that they're going to tell me how they are set up today, how their organization looks like today. And therefore, I will not go with a sequential model or a comparison model. I will stick to the static model, and I will know that I just need to start mapping down, as he speaks, how the organization looks like. And the static model for the organization could go like this. Well, John says, hey, we are set up like this, and I start mapping these things down. So he says, well, I'm leading the organization, the department, and then my right hand is Mary, and she helps me dealing with the rest. And she is also on the same level as a guy called Lucas, who is calling in because he couldn't join in person. And then under Mary, I have two teams at the moment. I have a team A and I have a team B, and as he says, and as he shares the story, I'm capturing these things down. And then he says, under Lucas, we are supposed to have the third team, but it's not there yet. So team C is something that is non-existent, so I would just draw a kind of a dotted circle around this team, and I'm asking a question, so when do you think this team is going to launch? And he says, well, our best intention is to launch the team on the 1st of May. So I quickly jot down these facts. And then we start discussing, like, well, what are these teams working on and what are the challenges, just to learn more. And then they say, well, the team A is working on some common services at the moment. and I draw a little product next to it and write down common services. And the team B is working on some ordering functionality. And once the team C is there, we would like them to support some business processes. So biz process support. That is something that gives me an understanding what these guys are working on and how we could support them, but it's still lacking the challenges. So I go and ask them, but where exactly these teams are struggling with and how can we help them? Because yeah, it's given me the picture of the organization, but I don't know where the priority is. Where should we together with Pete focus on in the first place? And then John and Mary look at each other and they say, well, okay, we might have different views on this, but I'll go first, I guess, says John. And he says, I think that with these two existing teams, we have issues with the backlogs. Mary looks at him and she nods, but that's what John offered as his personal observation. And that gives me a hint that that might not be shared with other people, but it's important to note down as his observation. So what I would do here is that I would draw a kind of a novel around these teams, and I would put a note with a label A to refer to them easier later, and I would quickly summarize like issues with backlogs. And I would also note down a small figure with John's name underneath, and I would put it as a speech bubble, because I need to remember that it was John who said that. Mary didn't give me any indication, any clear idea about whether whether she sees it the same way, or maybe she doesn't agree with that, but it doesn't matter as long as I remember it was coming from John. And maybe she says, well, yeah, I agree with that. And on top of this issue, I would like to say that if you ask me, I don't need help with Team A. They might be having some issues with backlogs, but from my perspective, says Mary, the biggest hurdle at the moment is that on Team B we have many inexperienced people, including our Scrum Master and Product Owner, and they really need some maturity help. And therefore, I draw a circle around the team, and I create a new note below saying like inexperienced team. And similar to how I've noted that with John, I would put Mary here and provide another speech bubble around it, because that's what she came up with. And I need to know she is the one who thinks so. And then John says, well, and clearly we need help with launching the team. And that was the first thing we had in our mind when we called you up, because Mary is busy with these two teams and she could probably handle those two issues we have mentioned so far. But that's precisely the launch of the Team C where we think you should be helping us in the first place. And therefore, I put another annotation here, C, and help launch the team. Help launch the team. Priority number 1. And again, a speech bubble around it, and I say, John mentioned that. So that gives me something. We underwent 2 phases of mapping here. We created the universe, how the organization looks like, and we also went through the phase 2 where we tried to map out our decisions and strategies, and it gives me something. And you know what is also happening as we're going through the conversation with these people? They have noticed me making notes, and we are sitting at the same table basically, and maybe they are sitting from the opposite side of the table or side by side with me. Regardless, they see me doing these things. And at some point in the meeting, they start using this as a reference map. And you see, people are used to holding meetings just talking and sometimes showing some slides. And I have noticed that even though people are used to that style of conversation, they prefer having visual maps more than that. So if you start doing this, if you start mapping the conversation and you keep your integrity and transparency and honesty of how you do that, so you don't, for example, contaminate that with your opinions, or like you're taking notes and then you say like, okay, I think it's stupid, then it's not going to work, because if you don't want people to see what you're noting down, then you cannot use that for the collaboration. But if you keep your integrity up and if you just objectively capture what you're talking about, then it can become your point of reference. It's not your private notes anymore. And basically you could even encourage. But what I have noticed doing the sketchnoting in a meeting like this is that people see what I'm doing, they can understand because I chose the appropriate visual structure to support this sketchnoting, and they can refer to that. So at some point John starts moving his finger around, and at that point I could even sit from the same side of the table, so it's easier for him. He doesn't have to look at the page upside down. But basically you will also notice that as you become more experienced in sketchnoting in a meeting, that people start using that as a reference map. So maybe we went through some circles of conversation where we were pointing fingers and moving our fingers through the pictures in order to anchor our conversation to this map. What usually happens is that we now need to arrive to some decisions. And then after we had a good conversation, which probably resulted in me adding some extra bullet points to the previously made notes. I will not detail them, I will just mimic those extra comments with wiggly lines here just to save some time. But maybe there were some extra comments that were important to be captured. Usually what happens once you are over the part of the meeting where you are exploring the options and strategies is that you need to converge now to the point where you're making the decisions about what happens next. And it's always very crucial and very helpful when you note these things down as well. So next steps. And next steps, I sometimes give it an icon of a clipboard, something looking like this, like a checklist. And remember that by using the icons, you increase the readability and comprehensiveness of your notes. So that's why I'm so keen of using the icons as much as I can. So for the next steps, I'm usually using the clipboard icon, and then we're starting to write down what we have agreed to as a group. And John and Mary says, yeah, we agree that the priority number one is to help launch the team. So I'll just like draw an icon for Lucas because it's his team, and then I say book a meeting to discuss how exactly we can launch the team. Launch Team C. That gives us the understanding about the subject for that particular meeting. And then they say, well, I want you to talk to the product owner and Scrum Master from Team B as your next, as a step number 2, because this is again an experienced team. I'm handling them, I'm coping, but I'm just curious to know your opinion about that. So talk to them. So I'm just noting down like PO, SM, and Mary, she also wants to introduce us to these guys. Book a meeting, Team B. And I'm using this shortcut for with W with the slash Team B to save time. And finally, they agree that it's less of a priority, but it would be nice if I looked into the issues with the backlog, as pointed out by John in the beginning of the meeting. So I say, okay, POs, Team A, B, discuss backlog. And they also ask me, well, be a bit sensitive here because we think the backlogs could be done better, but these are the POs and we don't want to hurt them. So make sure that conversation is respecting their work and you approach it from the perspective of how can I help you, and if they say nothing you can help us, then just be it, but they ask me just to be very careful and sensitive. And that's it. That's how my notes for this particular meeting could have ended up. And usually I don't do the gold plating during the meeting because it would look a bit weird and strange. But what I do is that when I need to reflect on what just happened, and if I have extra 5-10 minutes, or let's say I am preparing for the next step with these people and I want to understand what kind of insights I have collected from this meeting, I usually sit down with myself, or maybe I'm doing that together with Pete, and we are going through the meeting once again to understand what do we think about that. So I would circle around the subject. I would provide some shading highlights for the icons to help read the messy information map here. And as we do that, or let's say if I am doing that alone, I am also trying to understand what were the most important parts. So we were talking about the issues, and I'm using those codes like ABC to be able to refer to them, especially if we need to follow up with Pete. Like, okay, let's talk about the issue B here. And I even sometimes do some extra highlights to help myself navigate through the picture quickly. And next steps, and I also do like this in the next steps as well, so it's easier to see that there are 3 next steps. And again, I don't do that during the meeting, not to steal the time from the participants of the meeting, but I do that later on in order to, again, reabsorb, reinterpret the information and help myself structure in the memory what happened and what should be my next steps. And then, as we discussed, you could base your sketch notes in your meetings depending on the situation. So it could be around some static model, like in this example, because the organizational structure or a hierarchy is pretty much a static model, or if we have been discussing their process, how they work on with those teams and how do they plan, it could have been the sequential model. Or if we were talking about how we could help those particular teams, and we were discussing different strategies, then I would probably note those down in a sort of a comparison format to help see the differences between the choices. There are other things additionally to that I would like you to keep in mind when sketchnoting in a meeting, is that whenever you are in a need to rotate your notebook, do that. There is nothing better about it. When is that helpful to happen? When do you need a landscape orientation? Is usually when you have something related to time or a process. So just rotate your notebook like that, and that helps you to organize your space better, because whenever we're discussing time-related things, they demand more space horizontally. So just keep that in mind and be wise to use your available space in the best way possible. So rotate your notebook if you need to talk about time-related issues. It's more appropriate and more useful. And another thing to add to this is that sometimes you can use the entire spread of your notebook. If you're using the paper notebook where you cannot increase the size of the page like you can in a digital format, then what you could do sometimes...
I found this on the web.
So sometimes when you need to use the entire spread of your notebook, and especially when you use the physical notebook where you cannot change the size of the page like you can in the digital format, then you could create a larger map by just using the entire spread, both pages. So both pages for larger maps. For larger maps. And let's say if the organization we were discussing together with John and Mary in this case was much larger than 3 teams, and I wanted to have more space around it, I would be able to use the entire spread for that matter, and basically map the entire organization on the double size because of the 2 pages. So keep that in mind. Sometimes it makes more sense to do like that. And if you fear that you will run out of space. And finally, what else I would like to tell you here is that the best way for a person to navigate through the informational mass of your notes is to help through things like underscoring the titles for the sections, circling around clusters of related information, using shadows and highlights later on to solidify the structure and make it more comprehensive. Don't forget about those tools. And yeah, I hope you liked it and found it useful. And more importantly, I hope that now you know how to extrapolate this method to any meeting situation you might end up in. So have fun and good luck, and get ready for the next lecture.